As I said at the start, we're in this series, Why Believe? And it's been fun. We're going to keep it going today. We'll bring it back up next week. Let me kick this one off this way. A structural engineer sat eating under a nut tree in the courtyard of the company where he worked after receiving a huge bonus and a great promotion for all of his great work, and feeling pretty good about himself. As he sat there, he looked up at the tree, and then beyond the tree, looked up to the sky and said, "You know, God, you may be powerful, but you're really not very smart. You made this huge tree to produce these little teeny tiny nuts, but you made a small vine to produce huge watermelons. It doesn't make any sense. Huge trees with tiny produce, what a waste. And this tiny vine that can't sustain the weight of its fruit. It just doesn't add up." And as he was waxing on about structural load and weight bearing and architecture, a nut fell from the tree and hit him right on the head. He looked up and he said, "Thank God that wasn't a watermelon." You know, at some point or another in our lives, we do start to question God. And sometimes we think we know better. But if we direct our questions toward Him, and we have a sincere interest in His answers, He does answer. Because Jesus said, "Whoever asks, receives." And you know, oftentimes we question God at the times when things are really tough. When we're experiencing suffering and difficulty is when we most often or are most tempted to question, to wonder why. Job was that way. If you've ever read the book, you've heard the story, you know that that's the way he was. He was a man who was righteous. Everything was going great. He had a good family, great land, very successful, prosperous. And in seemingly a heartbeat, he lost everything. He maintained his righteousness. He didn't criticize or complain for the longest time. But finally, when enough was enough, he did start to question. In fact, one of the questions was, why was I even born? Have you ever felt that way? And have you ever felt like Job, where you weren't really getting an answer? At least it didn't seem like it for a longest time. When Job uttered that question, why was I even born? It took umpteen chapters of the book before God finally got back to him. And the answer that God gave probably was not the answer that Job was looking for, because Job got grilled at that point with a series of questions from God, like, well, where were you, Job, when I stretched out the heavens, and where were you when I poured all the water into the seas? You know, who are you to question? But through that biting criticism was an answer, and that is, God made everything, and He knows everything, and sometimes you just got to trust. You got to hang in there. And Job did. He humbled himself, and he was restored 7 times over before the end of the book, all that he had lost. But these are tough things. These are tough times. And there's just so much evil in the world. And why? Why is there so much suffering? And how do we, as believers in a good God, answer that question? Because it's been said, virtue in distress and vice in triumph has made atheists of mankind. Virtue in distress, vice in triumph makes atheists people. We're going to look at that today. We've already done a message called Dealing with Doubt. We've looked at foundations for faith. We've compared other religions. We, last week, argued with the atheists. And today we're going to look at one of the big questions that atheists and agnostics have for Christians. And the question goes something like this: how can there be a good God up there with so much suffering and pain down here? And you can't deny the reality of pain and suffering, can you? It's real. And we're going to look at some answers that are good answers, and they're really good answers. Theologically, philosophically, experientially. They're great answers, but at the end of the day, no matter how good they are, when we're talking about human suffering and real agony, we can't make light of it. We can't use these as pat answers for the difficulties that we experience in life. Because life is hard. And even if we got good answers, which we're going to look at here in a minute, it doesn't necessarily make the pain go away. At least not yet. We all know pain. We all know suffering. We all know it personally, right? It's not just the stuff that you've read in the newspaper or nobody reads newspapers anymore, that you've seen on the internet or you watched on TV. We all know pain. I've known pain. Seems like my whole life. I lost my father when I was like 11, 12 years old. My mom, single mom, raising a family of 5 kids on Social Security and a little bit of whatever the company had for them. It wasn't just the emotional strain. It was the financial strain. I knew that growing up. When I got married, I married this really smart, high producer wife, Lori, big real estate, salesperson, exec, and just one of the big producers in Chicago. And man, we were rolling in the dough. We had 6 figures plus. And then the real estate market crashed. And the church that I was pastoring split. And we went from having more money than we knew what to do with, trips around the world, to having 9 kids and not enough money to feed them. I mean, just to say how bad it was, I've said this once before here. We were dumpster diving to put food on the table. And, as bad as that is, I've seen people with way worse in this life. When I was just some years ago, not too many years ago, about 5 years ago, when I was up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, as a hospital chaplain, I saw just tragedy that's worse than anything I've experienced. I will never forget, I don't think as long as I live, an X-ray picture. It's been just laser imprinted on my brain. Young guy, about 20 years old, fresh out of jail, doing some stupid stuff when he was younger, but he was ready to turn his life around, and he had. For 6 months to a year, he stayed away from all his old buddies and was doing great. But the old buddies kept trying to drag him back out to some of the stuff that had landed him in jail in the first place, and he finally caved in. First time he had been out with any of his old drinking buddies on his motorcycle, racing through the country, coming up over a knoll, and smashed right into a car, oncoming vehicle. Both of them. His friend died instantly. And I don't know, that might have been grace, because this 20-year-old young man who had gotten his life back together and got pulled back down, he made it, but severed his spine. up pretty high, not down low. And in an instant, his life was changed. And I felt bad because I brought the mom in to the emergency room. And, what do you say? None of the answers I'm going to talk about here in a minute are going to make anybody feel better at that point. They talked. He was conscious, in traction, and, fully immobilized. And as she turned to leave the room, because they were flying him to Mayo Clinic in Rochester, she looked up at the x-ray. I wish they had turned that thing off before she came in, because the spine wasn't just broken, it wasn't just severed, it was completely displaced. It was a full 2 inches away from where it should be. She looked at it, stared at it for just a minute. She looked down at the ground and walked out. We live in a world where there's a lot of pain, and you have experienced it. And when we experience it, we ask questions. How could this happen? If there's a good God up there, what's going on? Atheists and agnostics, they've got a good question. How is this possible? Here's how the question goes. How can there be a good God if there's evil in the world? Or the way they really put it is this. If God is all good and God is all powerful, as Christians claim, why does evil exist? He must be allowing it for some reason. And the only thing that seems logical is either God's not all good or he's not all powerful. Either he's not all good, he looks down at the tragedy that our lives often are, and he doesn't care. Oh, thanks, buddy. Thanks for helping a brother out. Or maybe he's all good, but he's not all powerful. He suffers with us emotionally, but he can't really do anything about it. In either case, if God isn't all good or he's not all powerful, well, by definition, he's not God. It's a good question. And it's something that we have to answer. We have to wrestle with. I'm going to give you several answers this morning. First one is the most basic and probably the least satisfying, but it is true. First thing we got to remember is that God did not cause evil. We all know the story in Genesis. He put Adam and Eve in the garden. The serpent came in and tempted them to do what God said. God said, don't take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They did anyway. And that's what brought evil and suffering into this world, not God. He tried to stop us. He told us what would happen, that death would come if we did that. And we did it anyway. Here's how James put it. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. And then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. And that's exactly what God said would happen if they took of the tree. He didn't want that. Evil, the agony, the torment that we all know, that we read about on the internet and see on the news, was not God's idea. By the way, when we started this series, I asked you guys to shoot me questions, that you've got or that you have friends have about the faith. Somebody asked the question, how did the serpent speak? Because animals don't talk. And so just a quick answer to that, to whoever was that asked that. Bible doesn't actually say how it was that the serpent could talk to Eve, but what we, in fact, it doesn't even, in Genesis, doesn't even say who the serpent was. It just says the serpent. We don't find out until we read the last book of the Bible, Revelation, that the serpent was actually Satan, and he was speaking through this snake. And if you know your New Testament, the Gospels, demons can inhabit creatures. They try to possess humans to force us to do things that are against God's will. And they can also inhabit animals, as was the case with Legion. Jesus, the demons asked Jesus to not cast them into the abyss, but instead cast them into the pigs. And so Jesus allowed that and cast the demon out of the man and into the pigs. So as best we can figure, Satan possessed this serpent so that he could be in the three-dimensional material world in which we live, speak to Eve, and tempt her to do something that was going to bring about death. But so that's what happened, but that doesn't really answer the underlying question, does it? Because God knew in advance that was going to happen. So how can an all-good God, full well knowing what we were going to choose, allow that to happen? Isn't he culpable at that point? Why did he even give us the freedom to choose that? Why did he put the tree in the garden? But there is an answer for all of that. And the answer is free will. And this is pertinent to the question, because if God created us without the ability to choose, if he hadn't put the tree in the garden, if we had no ability to choose right or wrong, if all of our choices were engineered, manipulated by God, if we didn't have the freedom to choose of our own volition what we want, well then all of the good that we know would not exist either. Because love has to be a free choice, right? It's got to come from you. If you love something, set it free. If it comes back to you, it's yours. If it doesn't, it never was. You've heard that sappy little phrase. It's true, though. You have to have freedom to have love. We have to choose. You have to have freedom to forgive. You have to have freedom to be kind. These things can't be manipulated. That's got to come from you. There would be no good either if there wasn't our ability to choose it. All the goodness that we know comes from the ability to choose. And unfortunately, we've made the wrong choices. But God knew this all in advance. So how do you deal with that? C.S. Lewis and others have dealt with it this way, and I think that this is really true. Lewis says whenever there's an argument like this, you have to look at the underlying assumptions in the argument. So let's go back to the argument for a minute. If God is all good and God is all powerful, then how could evil exist? Either he's not all good or he's not all powerful. What's the underlying assumption here? The underlying assumption is there is evil. The goodness of God, the power of God, that's an if. If God, if God. But the thing in the question is, evil for sure exists, and we can't argue that, right? I mean, we all know that. But here's the thing. If evil exists, then good must also exist. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any reason, any basis upon which to compare. We know evil because we also know good. It's the opposite of good. So if anyone shares this argument with you, you can take them right through it logically. So you think evil exists, right? And they're going to say, yeah. And then you can ask them, so good must exist too, right? So that you can have a basis upon which to compare good and evil. And people are going to say, yeah. So there's this continuum. So there must then be a moral law, right? I mean, there must be something that we've got in our conscience, somewhere in our knowledge, we're able to discern right from wrong, right? There's a moral law. We all know it. We all kind of know deep down inside. You don't have to have the 10 Commandments to know that lying is wrong. You don't have to have the 10 Commandments to know that killing is wrong or stealing is wrong. We innately know this. First time you ever stole a cookie from the cookie jar, right? You were fearful you were going to get caught, and you felt a little guilty when the next person goes to the cookie jar and there's none left. Guilt, fear of judgment, shame. There is a moral law. There's good, there's evil, and there's a moral law that helps us to understand the difference between the two. And we seem to know that. Where did that come from? Is it in our DNA? Did it come from evolution? Did it come from random mutations and natural selection somehow produced in us a knowledge of good and evil and a conscience? There's no way. If there is good and there is evil and there's a moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver who has placed in us the knowledge that some of things are right and some things are wrong. The conscience has to, if there's a moral law, there's got to be a moral law giver. Evolution does not explain where that comes from, or in a variety of other things. How do we know beauty? How do we know goodness? How do we know virtue of any kind? There is a moral compass within each one of us, because we were created in the image of God, who is all good. The moral lawgiver is God, who is good. And because we're created in his image, we have a sense of what is good. And so we feel guilt when we do wrong. We understand and we experience both good and evil because we took from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But we prefer the good, don't we? When someone does you wrong, you don't like that, do you? When someone does evil, when you see something in the news, like a man jumps into a vehicle and mows down pedestrians and bicyclers, something in us rises up with rage and wants justice because we have a sense that is wrong. And we know what would be right. And the reason why is because we're created in the image of a good God. But we're making bad choices. If there is evil, there's suffering, there's pain, then there's good too. And if there's good and evil, then there must be a moral law that enables us to differentiate the two. And if there's a moral law, there's a moral lawgiver. The God of the Bible is the moral lawgiver. The very fact that we hate evil means that we actually agree with him. You see, the presence of evil doesn't necessarily prove there's no God. It actually proves the existence of God, at least the Judeo-Christian God, the one that we worship and serve. There's another argument that we should look at. We can make for the existence of God based on the presence of evil. And that is the miraculous, seemingly impossible truth that good often comes from evil. Check this out, if you guys can hit that video.
I was born in Melbourne, Australia, 1982, and my parents had no idea that I was going to be born without arms or legs. I was the only one that I ever saw without limbs. My faith in Jesus Christ was sealed after 7 years of wondering why, God, I was born this way. He he answered me very clearly through John chapter 9. And I gave my life to Jesus at 15 after reading about how he came across a man who was born blind. And I'm like, hey, hold on a second. This looks interesting. And no one knew why he was born that way. I'm like, perfect. So I read on, and in verse 3 of the 9th chapter, Jesus said, it was done so that the works of God would be revealed through him. And I'm like, wow, God, if you had a plan for the blind man, you do have a plan for me. And that was the beginning of my personal relationship with Jesus. Youth groups were starting to call me, churches were starting to call me, opportunities were opening up everywhere for me to share my testimony. I was speaking in front of 300 sophomore public high school students. 3 minutes into it, half the girls were crying. One girl in the middle of the room started weeping. She put up her hand and she said, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but can I come up there and give you a hug? In front of everyone, she came and she hugged me. She cried on my shoulder and whispered in my ear. No one's ever told me that they love me. No one's ever told me that I'm beautiful the way that I am. I couldn't believe it. It changed my life. At that moment, I knew God was ministering to her through me. It's not by my speech or my power. It was God. And my heart was ignited with a passion. And it was an awesome day to see one soul transformed forever. That was when I knew I was called to be a worldwide evangelist. Speak 2,000 times across 44 countries on 6 continents, from university campuses, 40,000 students in China, to India, where we're talking to sex slaves, to crowds in the jungle of India, 110,000 people, down to Indonesia and all of Southeast Asia, to speaking at congresses of nations like Colombia and Costa Rica, where you see the leaders of that nation commit that country to the Lord Jesus. To Korea and speaking to the next generation about depression and suicide, and to Eastern Europe, where we did Serbia, Slovenia, and Croatia. Then doors in the Middle East, the message of hope was spread throughout the whole Arab world. That is God. And we know we've just
good can come from evil. And you guys know that too. I'm not just talking about, the perseverance and the character that we get when we go through trials and difficulties, but think about it. It's true in your life too, isn't it? A lot of the best things that exist about you came because you went through a trial. You went through something difficult. How can good come from evil? Because there is a God who is all good. And he says, all things work together for the good of them that love him and are called according to his purpose. All things, not some things, not part things, not just the good things work good. Even the evil in this world, God turns around for good. There must be a God, because there's evil, and yet he turns good from it. In fact, the truth is, every good thing you have ever received in your Christian life comes because of suffering. The suffering of Jesus Christ, God's own Son. I'm going to go through about 7 things here, really fast, rapid fire, just to prove to you that God is actually, he didn't want evil. He didn't originate evil. That was us and Satan colluding together, but God is still at work in and around evil as it's going on to bring about good in our lives. And he's been doing that for 2,000 years, because 2,000 years ago, God's Son came into this world and he went through horrible suffering so that we could have life. Here's the first thing. Christ absorbed the wrath of God on our behalf by suffering. Galatians 3:13 says this, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. The curse that God pronounced on Adam and Eve and Satan, all the way back in the beginning, Christ absorbed on the cross. The wrath of God was turned away from you and me and turned toward his Son, his only begotten, perfect Son, Jesus Christ, so that you and I would not have to experience the wrath of God. 2, Christ bore our sins and purchased our forgiveness by suffering. Isaiah 53 verse 5 says this, he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Our forgiveness, the fact that we have a clean slate before God, that we are now friends with him because he has forgiven us, only happened because Jesus Christ went to the cross and paid the price that you and I could never pay so that God could forgive us. 3, Christ provided a perfect righteousness for us through suffering. 1 Peter 2:24 says this, he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds we are healed. You stand righteous before God. The righteousness that he looks at, when he looks at you, is the righteousness of Christ. He took the righteousness of Jesus that he lived out his whole 33 years, and he places that righteousness on you and on me just because we put our faith in him. And that clean slate and perfect righteousness that you and I get to walk around in came because Jesus suffered. Christ defeated death by suffering. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil. Hebrews 2:14. We can live our lives without the fear of death because Jesus has been there and come back. And the power of death was conquered because Jesus died. 5, he disarmed Satan by suffering. Colossians 2:14-15 say this, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us, he has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. Having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Christ suffered in the battle at the cross, but he won. And it's the cross which disarms the one thing that Satan now has over mankind. The ability to accuse. The devil can look and point at sin and tell God we all ought to be with him in hell. But Christ took away that ability and that accusation at the cross so that no longer can the serpent accuse us before God. And that all happened because one man suffered. Number 6, Christ purchased final healing for us by suffering. Isaiah 53:5 says this, by his wounds we are healed. We're healed a little bit now. Some of you here this morning have probably experienced physical healing. Probably a lot of us here have experienced emotional healing. We're different than we were. We're happier, we're healthier, we're more at peace, we have more joy than we did before we knew Jesus. And all of this comes because he went to the cross. He suffered. And by his wounds we are healed. And then one day we're going to experience complete and total healing. The book of Revelation says that he will wipe every tear from our eyes. And he heals all of our diseases. And there will be no more death. We will live forever with him. All because Jesus suffered. And the last one, Christ secured our eternal, and I know this sounds trite, but a friendly relationship with God the Father. 1 Peter 3:18 says this, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He suffered to bring us to God. We have fellowship, a great relationship, a friendly relationship, not a fearful relationship, but just a really amicable, wonderful father-child, friend-to-friend relationship with God because somebody, Jesus Christ, suffered. Every good and perfect gift comes from God. But it comes by the grace of God through our faith in God's Son who suffered. So here's the last thing I'd like to mention before we come to a time of communion. And this is the last, great argument for how can there be a good God in a world that's full of evil. Think about this. God could have stayed up in the ivory tower of heaven and walked the streets of gold while we were in misery down here. But our gospel, the Christian faith, declares that God the Son entered into our misery. He was born a man, and he suffered horrible betrayal, a miscarriage of justice that produced an unlawful and a horrific execution, a death sentence that is the worst ever devised by man, crucifixion. And he fully entered into that. For you and for me. He is an all-good and all-powerful God. He's all-good in that he came and he suffered. And he's all-powerful because 3 days later, he rose from the grave. All of our greatest joys and all of our deepest loves come from him. And so, I want to encourage you this morning, wherever you're at in your faith, I'd like to just ask you, isn't it time to believe? Believe in God. Believe in Jesus, his Son. There is horrible evil in the world, yes. We brought that in. But he brought himself in to the midst of our torment so that he could take it away. And one day, he will take it all away. Put your faith in Jesus. It's a compelling story. It's historically accurate. It's philosophically logical. It's unique among all the other religions of the world. It's compelling because everything we read in our Bibles is perfectly in tune with the best science has to offer, and it's compelling because it's changed people's lives for 2,000 years. It's a compelling story because it's true.